The billionaire barely looked up from his lunch. "If you can't play something worth hearing," he said calmly, "you don't eat." The words landed softly, almost politely, which somehow made them worse. They floated above the white tablecloths and polished silverware of the palm court, slipping into the quiet spaces between clinking glasses and muted conversations. Around them, Manhattan's winter light pressed against tall windows, gray and cold, while inside the restaurant, everything gleamed with warmth, money, and effortless belonging. Grace Miller stood near the host stand, her fingers wrapped tightly around the strap of her worn backpack. At 19, she looked younger than she was, her frame thinner than it should have been after months of shelter meals and skipped dinners. She had come in from the cold only minutes earlier, asking in a low, careful voice if there was any work available, dishwashing, bussing, anything honest that might earn her a meal. She wasn't asking for charity. She never did. Ethan Collins, the host, had offered her a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The restaurant was fully booked, he said, though several tables sat empty. Perhaps she'd have better luck somewhere less formal. His gaze flicked briefly to her shoes, then away again, as if the matter were already settled. Charles Whitmore noticed the exchange from his usual table by the windows. At 58, he wore his success the way other men wore winter coats, without thinking about it. His tailored suit rested easily on his shoulders. His watch caught the light when he lifted his fork, and people adjusted themselves when he spoke. He had built hotels across the country on the belief that order mattered, that everyone had a place, and that society worked best when people stayed in it. He rose from his chair with unhurried confidence and approached, studying Grace with detached curiosity. When she explained again that she was looking for work, any work, his lips curved into something that resembled a smile. "Work," he repeated, as if tasting the word. Everyone wanted to work, he said, until it came time to prove they deserved the reward. By then, nearby diners had begun to watch openly. A couple at a corner table paused mid-conversation. A server slowed her steps. Phones appeared, discreetly at first, then less so. Grace felt the heat rise in her face, but kept her shoulders straight. She had learned that looking down only made things worse. Charles gestured toward the grand piano in the corner, its black surface gleaming beneath the chandeliers. Entertainment was part of the experience here, he explained, his voice smooth and reasonable. If Grace had a skill that added value, something worth hearing, then perhaps she could earn her lunch after all. Otherwise, there were plenty of places in the city better suited to her situation. No one laughed out loud, but the tension carried its own cruel humor. Grace followed his gesture and saw the piano clearly for the first time. It sat untouched, elegant and silent, more decoration than instrument. For a moment, the noise of the room faded, replaced by a memory she hadn't meant to wake. Grace looks at the piano. For a moment, she almost turns away. Grace had slept in a shelter the night before. She hadn't touched a piano in 8 months. The cold still clung to her hair and jacket, the kind of winter chill that sank past fabric and into bone. Bowery Mission had been crowded, the air smelling faintly of soup and bleach, with cots lined up so close that turning over meant brushing a stranger's blanket. Grace had kept her backpack under her arm the way other people held a purse, tight, protective, like it contained her whole life. In a way, it did. A spare pair of socks, a crumpled Metro card, a folded receipt with a phone number that stopped working months ago. When the lights went out, she stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about how quiet her world had become without music. The grand piano in the corner hadn't made a sound yet, but it had already reached her. Even from across the room, it looked wrong sitting there, untouched, polished like a display case. Its presence tugged at something she'd kept locked away for survival. Just minutes earlier, Grace had been nothing but a girl in worn clothes asking for work, another face people could dismiss with a smile and a pointed suggestion. Now the piano pulled her attention like a memory with teeth. The sight of it didn't feel like hope, it felt like grief. Grace wasn't always homeless. 2 years ago, she had been the kind of student people spoke about in hushed, impressed tones. At Juilliard, she had spent long hours in practice rooms where the walls were thin and the air carried someone else's scales. Her fingers had learned discipline there, how to stay relaxed while the music demanded everything. Her parents had lived for those moments, sacrificing weekends, savings, and sleep so she could keep climbing. Her mother used to sit in the back of small recital halls, hands clasped, eyes shining as if every note were proof that the world could still be beautiful. Her father would wait until the last chord faded, then meet her backstage with the same sentence every time: "Don't forget what your gift is for." Then came the night that broke the timeline of her life in half. A drunk driver, one phone call, 2 empty chairs that never filled again. The grief arrived first, then the bills, then the slow stripping away of everything that had once made her feel safe. Insurance ran out. Rent didn't wait. The upright piano went to a stranger with cash and a truck. After that, Grace took whatever work she could find, cleaning office suites after hours, wiping fingerprints off glass doors, watching her hands roughen from soap and cold water. The calluses changed. The memory didn't. Back in the restaurant, she stood perfectly still, listening to the soft rustle of attention gathering around her. She could feel eyes on her, curious, entertained, already deciding the ending. Somewhere behind that attention was Charles Whitmore, calm and confident, as if he'd simply offered a fair exchange. He hadn't. He'd offered a stage built from humiliation. The smart move would be to step away, take the shame, and find food somewhere else. Pride didn't fill an empty stomach. But the piano was right there, close enough to smell the faint lemon polish on the wood. Close enough to remind her that there had been a time when she belonged to something larger than survival. Her throat tightened. For a heartbeat, she was 17 again, sitting at a practice room bench, shoulders loose, wrists lifted, her mother's whisper floating in her memory like a blessing. Music can't lie. It only tells the truth. Grace closed her eyes and heard her father's voice, steady and warm, as if he were standing beside her in the cold. "Don't apologize for your gift." Her eyes opened. She didn't look at the crowd first. She looked for Charles, found him, and held his gaze without flinching. Then quietly, as if setting the terms for something sacred, she said, "I'll play, but you'll listen." Grace didn't choose something simple. She chose a piece that terrifies professional pianists. The piano hadn't been truly played in years, until now. It sat under the palm court's warm chandeliers like a museum piece, glossy and untouched, as if its only job was to look expensive. But the moment Grace stepped behind it, something in the room shifted. The soft clink of silverware slowed, then stopped. A server paused mid-step with a tray balanced against her palm. 2 diners near the windows leaned closer, their voices dropping to whispers. A few phones appeared, carefully at first, then less so. Grace felt the heat rise in her face, but kept her shoulders straight. She had learned that looking down only made things worse. Charles gestured toward the grand piano in the corner, its black surface gleaming beneath the chandeliers. Entertainment was part of the experience here, he explained, his voice smooth and reasonable. If Grace had a skill that added value, something worth hearing, then perhaps she could earn her lunch after all. Otherwise, there were plenty of places in the city better suited to her situation. No one laughed out loud, but the tension carried its own cruel humor.
When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. She didn't announce herself, she announced the music. Chopin's Etude, Opus 25, number 11, Winter Wind. The title alone rippled through the room like a recognizable warning. A woman near the archway frowned, as if searching her memory. An older man at a nearby table lifted his head with sudden interest, his fork suspended in midair. Someone murmured, "Is that Chopin?" And the question traveled in hushed echoes. Charles let out a small laugh, more breath than sound. Ambitious? He said, as if he were being generous. His tone suggested that failure was inevitable and therefore entertaining. But Grace's hands didn't shake. They lowered to the cool ivory with the care of someone greeting an old truth. The first notes didn't arrive timidly. They came precise and controlled, shaped with intention, the kind of touch that made the instrument sound awake. The palm quartz acoustics, meant to soften conversation, turned the piano into a private concert shared by everyone at once. Grace's fingers moved with a clean, efficient speed that didn't look frantic. It looked like memory returning to its rightful place. The melody rose, and then the technical storm began to gather beneath it, each phrase laid down as if she had rehearsed it that morning, instead of surviving a world that hadn't wanted her. A server near the bar blinked hard, her eyes suddenly bright. A teenager by the window, who had been smirking minutes earlier, stopped smirking. Even the restaurant manager, Michael Reynolds, emerged from the back with a tense, confused look that softened into disbelief as he heard what was happening in his dining room. Charles's face tightened almost imperceptibly. This wasn't the sloppy performance he'd expected. This wasn't background entertainment. This was the sound of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and the room knew it too. Near the edge of the crowd sat Dr. Robert Hastings, an older gentleman with silver hair and the calm air of someone whose approval was difficult to earn. He had been watching without expression, but as Grace's hands launched into a passage that demanded fearless precision, his eyes narrowed, not in doubt, but in recognition. He leaned forward as if pulled by the music itself. Dr. Hastings leans forward and whispers, "This isn't amateur." Charles opens his mouth to take control again. Then a calm voice cuts through the room. "Shut up," the older man says quietly. "Don't you dare interrupt this." Just minutes ago, Grace was the unwanted guest at the host's stand. Now, the entire palm court felt suspended on the edge of her next note. The interruption landed like a switch flipping. Conversations died mid-syllable. A fork hovered above a plate. The quiet wasn't awkward anymore. It was reverent, the kind of hush people keep when they realize something rare is happening and they don't want to be the one who breaks it. Charles Whitmore froze where he stood. He wasn't used to being spoken to that way. Not in public, not by anyone. He searched the faces around him for agreement, for the subtle nods he usually received. Instead, he found a room that had already chosen. The calm voice belonged to Dr. Robert Hastings, seated near the aisle, posture straight, gaze steady. He didn't raise his volume or his hand. He didn't need to. Authority sat easily on him, earned and unquestioned. Grace never looked up. The storm section of Winter Wind surged forward beneath her fingers, the right hand flying in clean, fearless runs while the left anchored the rhythm with unwavering control. This was the passage that exposed pretenders. Here, mistakes were loud. Here, nerves showed. Grace's didn't. Her breathing stayed even. Her shoulders remained loose. Each phrase landed with intention, not speed for speed's sake, but shaped as if she were telling the instrument where the wind should turn. Around her, the room transformed. Servers gathered near the archways, trays forgotten. A woman near the windows wiped at her eyes without realizing she was crying. A couple of diners lifted their phones, no longer hiding it, the screens catching the blur of Grace's hands. Someone whispered about tipping, about how they'd never seen anything like this here, not ever. Michael Reynolds, the manager, stood rigid near the back, watching reputations shift in real time and understanding that whatever this moment was, it had already escaped control. Charles tried again, his voice thinner now, edged with irritation. He didn't finish the sentence. Dr. Hastings didn't look at him this time. His attention remained on the piano, on the music doing what words never could. The room followed his lead. Charles felt it, the sudden absence of gravity where his influence used to be. Money didn't matter here. Volume didn't matter. Only the sound did. Grace drove into the final climb with a quiet ferocity that seemed to pull the chandeliers closer. The palm court's acoustics wrapped around the notes, letting them bloom and fade with perfect clarity. Each run was clean, each accent landed where it should. When the last chord finally struck, it wasn't rushed or forced. It rang out full and bright, then released into a silence so complete it felt physical. For one breathless moment, no one moved. Then the room erupted. Chairs scraped back as people stood. Applause thundered against marble and glass, rising in waves that shook the space Charles had once owned. He stood apart from it all, hands empty, face pale, watching the center of the room shift decisively away from him. Dr. Hastings rose last. He stepped forward, eyes fixed on Grace as the clapping continued around them. "Miss, what's your name?" Grace wipes her cheeks, still stunned by the applause. "Talent doesn't know social class," she says quietly, and the room goes heavy with meaning. The words aren't loud and they aren't sharp, but they cut deeper than shouting ever could. They settle over the palm court like a truth no one can pretend they didn't hear. People stop clapping, not because the moment is over, but because it has changed. The same diners who had watched Grace moments ago with curiosity now look at her with something closer to humility. They see, perhaps for the first time, how easily they had accepted the idea that she didn't belong. Dr. Robert Hastings steps closer, his expression gentle now that the storm has passed. He introduces himself without ceremony, as if titles would only cheapen the moment. He asks where she studied, how long it has been since she last played. Grace answers honestly, her voice steady despite the weight in her chest. "Juilliard," she says, "a lifetime ago." Around them small reactions ripple, soft gasps, raised brows, a quiet understanding clicking into place. This hadn't been luck, it had been buried excellence. Jonathan Price appears from the edge of the crowd, guided forward by someone eager to make introductions. He doesn't waste time. He recognizes the sound he's heard, the discipline behind it, the rare combination of technical mastery and emotional restraint. He speaks to Grace the way professionals speak to each other, not like someone offering charity. There are questions about concerts, about reconnecting with the world she was forced to leave. Grace listens more than she speaks, nodding slowly, as if the moment might vanish if she moves too quickly. Laura Bennett waits until Grace has a glass of water in her hands before approaching. She asks permission before asking questions, framing the story not as a miracle, but as recognition long overdue. Michael Reynolds quietly instructs a server to bring food, real food, plated carefully, and makes it clear it's on the house. His apology is brief and sincere, the kind meant to correct, not to perform. Charles Whitmore stands alone near his table, the noise washing around him without touching him. No one confronts him, no one needs to. Michael approaches with professional calm and asks him to settle his bill and take the rest of the day away from the palm court. "Membership will be reviewed," he adds, evenly. Charles nods once, stiffly, and leaves without another word, the echo of his earlier certainty following him out into the cold. Grace finishes eating slowly, surrounded but not crowded. Business cards find their way into her hands. Offers are made carefully, respectfully. She thanks everyone, refusing to let bitterness creep into her voice. When asked later about Charles, she only says that assumptions are easy and dignity is not. She hopes people remember that. 6 months later, Grace walks onto the Lincoln Center stage and places her hands above the keys. This time, everyone is listening from the very beginning.